Executive Director of the Jeannette Rankin Peace Center. And as you may know, thank you. That's for the Peace Center, I'm sure now. As you may know, we've been in Missoula over 26 years, working for nonviolence, social justice, and environmental sustainability. Much of that work depends on educating ourselves. That's the tools that we need to sort of wage that fight.
Right on.
And as long as I can remember, one of the best tools has been alternative radio. Every Monday. Come to the Peace Center, you can hear it. The Peace Center has been sponsoring that because that's part of our mission to provide that and help make that happen. And you all know the voice. I followed this guy around for 2 days and everybody says, now what's a voice? Where did I know that voice from? I know that voice. So you're in for a treat tonight. The Jeannette Rankin Peace Center is a membership organization, and if you're members, thank you very much. I see lots of you out there. If you're not, please consider joining us because we need your voice to be with us. We brought David here. He's traveled all over the world, never been to Montana before. So we're very, very pleased to have him, and I'm counting on you all to give him a warm Missoula welcome. The one thing he did waive graciously his hairdresser and four-star hotel and makeup artist and all of that for us. However, we still had some expenses, so I'm going to pass a couple baskets around, and I know some of you gave at the door, but if you can help us to fund this, we would appreciate it greatly. Thank you again for coming, and I know you're going to be in for a treat.
How's that? Can you hear me back there?
Yeah. That's the words I heard.
One of the things I learned from our great friend and mentor Howard Zinn is the use of humor. And I try to inject a little bit of humor in my presentations. For example, we interrupt this program from the University of Montana to bring you this breaking news story from TIBC, the Truth in Broadcasting Corporation, from our secret underground headquarters in Area 51 in Nevada. I'm Dick Veneer, your glib and banal anchor of Facade News, the 24/7 newscast dedicated to keeping you in the dark. We go straight to the surface of a story, and we stay there. No one can challenge our in-shallow reporting. We are motivated by the highest ethics of journalism. Facts, documentation, and evidence don't count. We deceive, you believe. Ladies and gentlemen, an amazing story coming across our news desk right now. According to an obscure community organization in Missoula, the Rankin Center, they are reporting that Ben Bernanke, Hank Paulson, Alan Greenspan, Timothy Geithner, Larry Summers, Robert Rubin, Lloyd Blankfein, and other government officials and bankers have been arrested for financial crimes against the American people. They were found under the Higgins Avenue Bridge in a bunker under a huge mattress with trillions of dollars in cash, a stash of World Wrestling Federation DVDs, and a massive collection of Pat Boone and Kenny G CDs, and scores of Papa John used pizza boxes. They were taken into custody by a heretofore unknown group calling itself MULF, the Missoula Liberation Front. Pepsi, a so-called spokesperson for this group, who would not give her last name, said, "This action is long overdue. We're dedicated to nonviolence and did not use force. But we had to act. We can no longer wait for the Justice Department to bring these people to trial. We're sick and tired of waiting. They must face justice," she said, with her voice rising in indignation. The prisoners, shackled in orange jumpsuits and with black cloaks over their heads, were later reported to have defiantly shouted at their captors, "Do you know who we are? We are the masters of the universe. We are the lords of finance. We control America and the world." And then, inexplicably, almost every one of them burst into tears and said, "We want our mommies." If convicted, they'll do time at Guantanamo. You'll recall the infamous U.S. Prison camp that was returned to Cuban sovereignty late in the year 2012. It looks like curtains for the former masters of Wall Street. Their heads were bowed as they were led away by blue-helmeted peacekeepers of MULF, the Missoula Liberation Front, headed by Commander Rusty, who would also not give his last name. I'm Dick Veneer. You're still a glib and banal anchor of Facade News. Stay tuned for the TIBC network for updates on this breaking news story. Remember, we deceive, you believe. You either watch our news or you will be watched. And now back to our regularly scheduled program at the University of Montana. Well, good evening. It's wonderful to be here. As Betsy mentioned, it's my first ever visit to Missoula and to Big Sky Country, Montana. And I don't think I've missed a beat. I've spoken in Damascus, Aleppo, Beirut, Cairo, Tehran, Istanbul, New Delhi, Bombay, New York, and London, and now Missoula. So I'm trying to keep that, at a very high level. But this is it. This is the max right now. And hats off to Betsy and the Rankin Center. I think they're just doing fabulous work. And with the holiday season coming up, this is a time, do your shopping there. Don't waste your money at some corporate box store. There's some great things. I spent, part of this afternoon picking up some things for my family as well. And this is a unique institution. I know that's an overused word, but I travel all over, the United States, and there are very few Rankin centers. There's very few centers like what you have here in Missoula. So you should treasure it, you should nurture it, you should support it, like you support your garden, like you support your plants with love, with sunlight, with water and affection. The same way with the Rankin Center. Don't take it for granted. It's a great, great opportunity, and I was thrilled to learn about, the life and work of Jeannette Rankin and her staunch advocacy for peace, which has never been a popular position in the United States. And it was Martin Luther King on April 4th, 1967 at Riverside Church in New York, who said it's time to break the silence around the issues of U.S. aggression and U.S. militarism and the U.S. permanent war economy. That basically since the end of World War II, we have been living in a state of at war or about to go to war or threatening war, and the military is now the dominant sector in the economy, with very deleterious and damaging effects, not just morally, but also economically and in our standing around the world. And it was King in that same Riverside Church speech, April 4th, 1967, marked the date because exactly a year to that date he was murdered in Memphis, where he had gone to organize striking sanitation workers in a Poor People's March to have been followed in Washington, D.C. And he said in that New York speech, the greatest purveyor of violence in the world today is my own country. And he reported this with, not with glee, not with joy. I don't celebrate this either, but with great sadness, but with realism. And I think, we have to be honest when we're talking about the foreign policy of the United States as well as its domestic policy. There's now a looming war with Iran, the threat of war. The U.S. is, under the Obama administration, has surrounded Iran with aircraft carrier battle groups, military bases, more weapons, more material being sent to the Persian Gulf to ward off the threat from Iran. I guess, when I was in Boulder the other day, I saw, low-flying Iranian planes right over Boulder. It was really brazen. They apparently have no shame whatsoever. They were flying so low I could see the pilots. I'd wave at them and they waved back. And 2 weeks ago, as I was on the Pacific Coast in Fort Bragg and in Mendocino County, and there, right in broad daylight, Iranian submarines surfacing right off the coast of the United States. A little further down Point Arenas, there was an Iranian aircraft carrier. So clearly, but folks, we're being taken for a ride again. This is another unnecessary war that's great for the military-industrial complex. That's music to the ears of Lockheed Martin and Northrop Grumman and Raytheon and Boeing and General Electric and General Dynamics and United Technologies and all the other components of the military-industrial complex. It's music to their ears because conflict means weapons sales. Conflict means more profits. And contrary to what you hear constantly from the propaganda machine about, these are great, it's great for the American economy. Well, that's full of that well-known substance, that particular argument, because studies have been done very carefully about military weapons production. And there's one thing to be said about them, and that is extremely capital intensive. That is true. A lot of money goes into it, but it's not labor intensive. We can create many more jobs building hospitals and clinics and schools and colleges and universities and roads and repairing the environment and doing the kinds of things that the New Deal did in the 1930s, creating national parks, restoring and building trails, building rec centers, swimming pools. All of those things are labor intensive, and the military-industrial complex has sold us this line of lies that it's also creating a lot of jobs. Well, it's creating a handful of jobs and huge profits for these contractors. So they have an institutional investment in conflict and war. And there you see they're constantly stoking that there'll be more U.S. intervention. And right now, there's a lot of, one could say, a lot of negative things about Iran and its government. I've been there a couple of times. I speak a little bit of Farsi. I can get around. I did a book on Iran called Targeting Iran. And it's interesting to point out that Iran has not invaded another country in 250 years. You cannot go 2.5 months in U.S. history and make that same kind of statement, particularly since 1945 when the U.S. becomes the global hegemon. So it's either direct intervention, occupation, bombings, or what's going on now, economic warfare, which is what sanctions are, or cyber warfare, which is being conducted against the Iranian state. That is, cyber warfare is, according to the Pentagon, if anyone did it to the U.S., it would be considered an act of war. But when the hegemon does it, it of course gets a permanent free pass, no comments, no Security Council resolution, no pious commentary from Thomas Friedman in the New York Times, or Charlie Rose on PBS, or Jim Lehrer on the NewsHour, or Robert Siegel on Some Things Considered, or the lamentable Cokie Roberts on Morning Edition, that's Mourning. because every time I hear it, I'm going into mourning. In fact, that's one of the reasons alternative radio started. And for the younger people in the audience, I want to encourage you to get involved in the media. It's not very difficult. I barely graduated from high school, and I dropped out after a year of college in San Francisco. But you don't need specialized training to do this kind of work. You just need common sense, dedication, and a sense of skepticism, you know, and you want to investigate things. Who is benefiting from, let's say, the current arrangements of the U.S. Economy? Is it the 1%, as is claimed by Occupy, or is the 99% benefiting from this kind of concentration of wealth and income? You know, I think the answer is self-evident. I was in San Jose on September 11th, of course, a date which will live in infamy, and there was a front page headline. First of all, Governor Brown is saying that the state of California, the richest state in the richest country in the world, is not bankrupt. He had to announce this to the people of California. Thank you, Governor. And then the adjoining column here is, will this wound ever be healed? And it's a picture of the World Trade Center. And the answer to that is no. It will never be healed. It will constantly be used as a bludgeon to further justify burgeoning military budgets and more intervention. This is the whip now that is being used also to silence dissent, to eviscerate and shatter constitutional rights and guarantees that have been won in this country over, you know, many years of struggle. That's partly what's going on under the rubric of 9/11. And I think Glenn Greenwald is certainly among the best civil libertarians anywhere. He's, you know, in the U.S. And he says this actually in an introduction to a program called The Surveillance State, one of the CDs I've brought along this evening. Snooping, prying, eavesdropping. Call it what you want, the government is doing it on a scale never before seen. Sophisticated new technologies allow for more intrusions into our private lives. Beyond the ever-present cameras, there's deep data mining, nanosecond biometric identification, and drone aircraft in the skies above. The invasive monitoring of public space and the simultaneous erosion of our constitutional rights has largely been a bipartisan effort. State surveillance power undermining basic freedoms in the name of protecting them. That's always what has happened historically. I need to take your freedoms away from you in order to preserve them, in order to protect you. It's a scenario right out of Orwell. And if you look at, you should read 1984 again and Animal Farm. You can see that Orwell actually underestimates the amount of state surveillance that is available today. The swelling domestic databases of the NSA and FBI probably contain your personal information. They certainly contain mine. And this burgeoning Orwellian apparatus has become a cash cow for a lot of corporations providing what is euphemistically called security services. Comedian Stephen Colbert sarcastically observes, he's one of the, I think, most trenchant analysts that we have around. He and Jon Stewart apparently are the two people that a lot of Americans get their news and information from and analysis. Well, after listening to the corporate control media, can you blame them? Or, you can turn to NBC, CBS, ABC and get the same old dribble and verbiage and palaver about the greatest nation on earth and things like that. And Colbert said, there are bound to be casualties in the never-ending war on terror, and one of them just happens to be the United States Constitution. Now, I think for people who call themselves conservatives, historically, conservatives have always been in the forefront of protecting our civil liberties, protecting us from government intrusion. At least the conservatives that I grew up with in the 50s, like Taft, like Eisenhower, Vandenberg, people like that, were very vigilant and diligent about protecting our privacy. That, of course, has completely gone by the wayside. The people who call themselves conservatives today are, in fact, wild-eyed radicals. If Eisenhower were alive today, he would be considered a radical. He would have no place in the Republican Party and no place in the Democratic Party as well. Remember Eisenhower, right? Five-star general, commander of all Allied forces in World War II, leader of the D-Day invasion, two-time president of the United States. What did he say at the beginning of his term? Every penny spent on the military is, in the final analysis, a theft from children who are hungry and who are cold and need to be clothed. A theft, every penny that is spent. That was in 1953. He ends his presidency on January 17th, 1961, I'm old enough to remember it, where he warned the country about a very ominous development. He said there's a military-industrial complex that's growing up and generating more and more power and control. And that was the first time that that phrase was used. So those are the bookends, you know, that you could see the Eisenhower presidency from 53 to 61. He also said a very interesting thing in the next paragraph, that the only way to counter this growing military-industrial complex, which he thought would threaten democracy and America's standing in the world, was if the citizenry were informed. So he made a connection between information and democracy as a counterbalance to this growing military-industrial complex. If he were alive today, he wouldn't recognize the country. And as I said, it tells you a lot about how the political spectrum has changed in our country over the last 50 years, when someone like Eisenhower would be considered a radical today. Now, there's, of course, you know, Iran is getting targeted for possible military action. A lot of the same voices, you know, we live in the USA, the United States of Amnesia. That's Gore Vidal's line, not mine. And as Chomsky says, if we don't remember the past, you know, and others have said this as well, you know, we're condemned to relive it, you know. And it was just 10 years ago that there was an endless stream of reports and warnings from Condoleezza Rice and Colin Powell and George Bush, you know, about the danger that Iraq was going to attack us. Iraq had weapons of mass destruction. We were going to be, you know, destroyed. We had to defend ourselves, etc. Many of these very same people that were writing editorials and op-eds then are now regurgitating the same press releases and just changing the cue in Iraq to an end for Iran and repeating the same motifs and tropes over and over again. How many times are we going to be duped? How many times are we going to be fooled by a propaganda machine which has no interest in evidence, no interest in facts, that wants to galvanize a population, whip up patriotic fever, you know, God bless America, wave the flag, have parades, support our troops, yada, yada, yada. And this is a very dangerous moment that we face once again. People like Bill Kristol, people like Charles Krauthammer are in the media again warning us that Iran is about to attack. We have to do something about Iran. You know, there are certain countries in the world that are not even members of the Non-Proliferation Treaty. Iran happens to be a member of the Non-Proliferation Treaty. Under the treaty, it has a right to develop uranium for peaceful purposes. Of course, the allegation being made, it is not being done for peaceful purposes. Well, there are three countries that happen not only to have nuclear weapons, but more importantly, the ballistic missiles and aircraft to deliver those weapons. They are Israel, India, and Pakistan. Three countries all in the US orbit, all in the US sphere of influence. No one is calling them out for not even being a signatory to the Non-Proliferation Treaty. Now, I'm not saying, you know, Iran they're angels. I don't know what their motivations are. I did study geography in school. It was another subject that was taught like penmanship. And I happened to notice that in a map of Iran, I'll hold it close to the microphone so you can see it. Let's see here. Yeah, does that work? Yeah. Whoa! Iran is in what part of the world?
Middle East.
Middle East, yes. And the United States is in what part of the world? North America, 8,000 miles away. Nevertheless, the New York Times are, our best newspaper by far, and I'm serious about that. It is an excellent newspaper if you know how to read it. If you can decode the propaganda, cut through the euphemisms when they talk about U.S. interests. They don't mean your interest. They mean the interests of the corporations. They mean the interests of the ruling class. That's our national interest. We're all supposed to feel good about that. Everybody in the Rankin Center and alternative radio and other, institutions are supposed to, excel and exalt in that feeling. Well, this is part of our interests as well. So here you have a front page story in the New York Times. Iran seeks wider Middle East role. How dare they? Who do they think they are? What part of the world do they think they're located in? We can go, you never know. I never know when I give these talks about what pronouns to use because I feel so disconnected and detached from the imperial war machine. But let's say we or they're the ones that carry it out. They are able to go 8,000 and 10,000 miles away, bomb Pakistan, Somalia, Yemen, occupy Iraq, occupy other countries. But Iran, which happens to be right there in the region, has no right to be concerned about what's going on its borders. It is in fact bordering two very unstable states, that is to say Pakistan and Afghanistan, both full of Sunni jihadists who regard Iran, if you know about the Shia-Sunni split in Islam, the Orthodox Sunnis regard the Shias as kufr, as basically infidels. They're not Muslims, and they should be killed. So there's a huge movement financed by Saudi Arabia, our very close allies, and paradigms of human rights and humanitarian concerns for women. It's all bankrolled by them. So Iran, I think, has reason to be concerned about the particular part of the globe that they inhabit. And they're completely surrounded by U.S. bases. In fact, just a week ago, the change you can believe in president dispatched another aircraft carrier to the Persian Gulf. The U.S. has 11 aircraft carrier battle groups. We're not talking here, Starbucks latte money here. We're talking billions and billions of dollars of our taxpayer money that is used in these endless deployments to control the 7 seas, turning the Mediterranean and the Persian Gulf into virtual U.S. lakes. We have the 5 Great Lakes, and I think you have a big one in Kalispell. We should add the Mediterranean and the Persian Gulf as well because of the huge military presence. Now, what is it that attracts our country to this part of the world? Another really tough question. Cauliflower, broccoli, come on, dates, Brussels sprouts. There's Brussels sprouts. Organic, shade-grown, fair trade Brussels sprouts in the Middle East is known to be a great, great resource that the U.S. wants to command. Going back to 1943, when it was already very clear what the outcome of World War II would be, the U.S. would emerge as the supreme military and economic power. Britain and France will have been basically also be very, very weakened and diminished, would not be able to reconstruct their pre-war colonial empires. And so the State Department was tasked by the White House to come up with what the post-war world would look like. These are documents, you can get them, you can look it up on the internet, under Grand Area Planning. And Grand Area Planning identified the oil resources of the Middle East, and I'm quoting here directly, the greatest source of strategic power and a stupendous source of material riches. And the corollary to that, of course, was that the U.S. was going to get it. And that was all sealed. The pact was written in blood on February 12, 1945, when a then ailing Franklin D. Roosevelt met with Ibn Saud, the king of Saudi Arabia, on the USS Quincy in the Suez Canal, and the deal was made. In return for your oil and access to your oil by our corporations, then it was, Standard Oil and the like. They have different names now. ExxonMobil inherits that Standard Oil. In return, we will protect the Saudi dynasty. And that's the Faustian bargain that the U.S. engaged in 45, and it has been informing U.S. policy ever since. So we have to be, very, very, I think, skeptical about the claims made about Iran. We should be skeptical in general when large states like the United States, which is crumbling within, but externally has this incredibly macho posture, has gold-plated weapon systems, has Trident submarines, has all kinds of weapons that are being developed against enemies that don't exist but may exist, may happen. They may evolve. And of course, the more that we keep bombing these countries, the more you'll get headlines like this in Newsweek: Muslim rage. Well, what do Muslims have to be angry about? Don't they enjoy having their mosques and wedding parties and homes being bombed by U.S. drone aircraft? Gee, it's odd, isn't it? What about Afghanistan, Pakistan? The U.S. is now, in thinking about attacking it. In fact, it's already at de facto war with Iran, yet another Muslim country. So yes, there is a lot of rage. But you see the racism in the media. Hundreds of thousands, if not many more, are slain in Christian countries by Christian leaders. But have you ever seen a Newsweek cover called Christian Rage or Hindu Rage or Buddhist Rage? Islam is singled out right now as the enemy du jour. It has replaced the Soviet Union as the organizing principle for U.S. militarism and U.S. imperialism. Everything is justified because of Islam, aggressive Muslims. They hate us because of our freedom. 11 years after 9/11, no one has any idea why the U.S. was attacked. They hate us for our freedoms. No, they don't hate us for our freedoms. They hate us for our foreign policy and military intervention in the Middle East and in South Asia. But do any of the candidates talk about these in these farcical debates? Of course not. The question cannot even be raised. You cannot even talk about aggression and affix the adjective U.S. or American before it, because it doesn't happen. We are the victims. Par excellence. We are attacked. We are innocent. We want to spread democracy. If you keep repeating lies, as Goebbels found out in the 1930s, people start believing it. And unfortunately, too many of our fellow citizens have swallowed the Kool-Aid about American innocence and benign intent. Well, yes, I guess now we could say the war on Vietnam and Laos and Cambodia. It was a great tragedy, and as Jimmy Carter said, both sides suffered equally. Oh yeah, both sides suffered equally. 58,000 Americans were killed, and 3 to 5 million Indo-Chinese. That's equal suffering. Much of Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia was turned into scorched earth. Chemical weapons were used on the Vietnamese, that is to say, weapons of mass destruction. Agent Orange containing dioxin and and DDT, for which the Vietnamese, Laotians, and Cambodians are still suffering from to this day because of birth defects, because of contamination. There's still a lot of unexploded ordnance all over Indochina. So yeah, you could say that, as Carter did, that both sides suffered equally. It's that imperialist hubris and arrogance that prevents people from seeing the realities of U.S. foreign policy, and hence the consequences. You know, because if you don't know what's going on, and then suddenly the towers come down, well, it must be because they hate us, they hate our freedoms, etc. I think we need to do a much better job of informing ourselves, but we really don't have a media in this country that can do that job because they have been taken over by a handful of corporations. When I started doing this work in the early 1980s, a book came out by Ben Bagdikian, who's a pretty mainstream journalist. You know, he's no I.F. Stone or Studs Terkel, or Seymour Hersh for that matter. He wrote a book, he said, I see something really ominous that's happening in the media sphere in our country. He said 50 corporations control most of the media in the United States. Well, he wrote subsequent editions to that book called The Media Monopoly. 50 became 28, 28 became 23, 23 became 14, 14 became 10, 10 became 6, and today 5 corporations basically control what most people see, hear, and read. And that's why you have these, idiotic types of discussions in the corporate media, and I'm also including PBS and Charlie Rose and the NewsHour and Morning Edition and All Things Considered, where they're asking questions. How dangerous is the Iran threat? Is Social Security going bankrupt? There's no problem with Social Security, brothers and sisters. This is another hoax that is being played on you by the powers that be. The Social Security system is very sound. It just requires a few tweaks, and Richard Wolff in this book, Occupy the Economy, talks about it in detail. Just to give you one example of a very simple thing that could be done that would guarantee the solvency of Social Security throughout the 21st century. Do you know what the maximum cap is on Social Security taxes? It's $107,000. So let's hope you earn $107,000. That's exactly the same amount that Bill Gates and Warren Buffett and Donald Trump and the Koch brothers and Sheldon Adelson are paying on Social Security. All you need to do is raise that cap to $200,000 or $207,000 or $307,000. They wouldn't even notice. That's like lunch money for them. That's like chump change. It's really nothing. That would guarantee the solvency of Social Security. So you see.
You gotta have interest on treasury bills, which we don't have.
So we have to be, I think, very careful. We have to, as Chomsky says, we have to insulate ourselves from this kind of propaganda. Even though the lies are cascading like Niagara Falls, upon the people. There's a tsunami, a constant tsunami of lies and half-lies. And incidentally, they're even talking about this now openly. We now live in the post-truth era, where facts don't matter. People make things up. Apparently last night in the debate, or whatever it was, the discussion, with Martha Raddatz, who's one of the most hapless of these network so-called journalists, whose real talent is hair. That's where they put their resources. She and Diane Sawyer and all the others, Brian Williams. It's about who has the best hair on the air. They are stenographers to power, lapdogs with laptops. Basically, we don't have a fourth estate, we have for the state. That's their societal function. We have a press corps that is absolutely asleep at the wheel. I'll just give you one of a million examples. And, to do this work, it just requires some common sense and, a sense of skepticism. During the height of the Tahrir Square uprising, Hillary Clinton holds a press conference in Washington, D.C. with all of these, characters in the front, and she announces to the world that no country has done more for democracy in Egypt than the United States of America. Now, I almost fell out of my seat, knowing that for 30 years, the US has backed the Mubarak dictatorship to the hilt, with billions and billions of dollars in cash that went mostly to the military. The Egyptian people never saw any of that money, and all kinds of diplomatic and political support for Mubarak. And not one of those so-called journalists said, excuse me, hello, that doesn't quite track with the historical record. They just sit there like robots and take their notes and then repeat it the next day or that evening on the news that this is what Hillary Clinton said. Sometimes, as Orwell once pointed out, the hardest thing to see is right in front of your nose. And a lot of the propaganda is right in front of our noses, and when we miss it. We miss it because we don't have the intellectual tools for self-defense. And that's where education comes in. I can't speak about this great university, probably one of the pillars in the country. But I can tell you about the University of Colorado at Boulder, where I don't teach there. I've lectured there occasionally, very occasionally. They've just eliminated their journalism department, so there's no longer a journalism department. And guess what? All the money's going into athletics, sports, business, and law, because that's where the money's coming from rich alumni and from the corporations who are producing, the next round of MBAs and CEOs and CFOs, to make sure that the cogs in the machine are well oiled and continue. So there's, a lot to say about Iran, about imperialism. I do want to, and that's of course another topic that cannot be discussed, at least not in polite company. You cannot talk about US imperialism. You can talk about British and French and Roman and Greek, but US imperialism doesn't exist. The fact that we have 737 bases at last count around the world seems to be no indication of any kind of imperial military strategy. While here at home, in the homeland, our basic rights are being undermined and eviscerated, as I said, and schools are being closed, consolidated. The great state of California, which had the premier public university system, not just in the country, but was a model for the world, is undergoing enormous retrenchment, consolidation of classes. Just to give you one example, I was in Fresno a couple of weeks ago lecturing in a friend's class. I lectured in the class last year, and there were 40 students. This year there were 120 students in the same class. So I turned to Mary and I said, well, what's going on? Well, this is what's happened. There's been a wage freeze. We're asked, if we're not being laid off, 11,000 teachers have lost their jobs in California. If we're not being laid off, we're asked to do more and more with less and less. And then she confessed that her greatest fear now as a teacher is to be in a public place and to meet one of her students and not know who that person is. Whereas before there was this, one-on-one contact in a smaller class environment. So we see, health clinics closing, emergency rooms closing around the country, all kinds of things that need to be attended to here, while this other America, strides the globe with this, empire of bases. It's unsustainable. It's not only is the Pentagon the greatest destroyer of the environment, it is the greatest destroyer of international law, which it flagrantly ignores. But this goes way back. It goes back to Pablo Neruda, the great poet of Chile, who wrote a poem called The Standard Oil Company. That was Rockefeller's Standard Oil Company, which today is ExxonMobil. Took on different names and different forms. These are the folks who brought us the Ludlow Massacre in Colorado, just a few hours south of Boulder, where I live, where immigrant miners, coal miners, were brutally executed by thugs hired by John D. Rockefeller. That was in another era. This is what Neruda wrote. Their obese emperors from New York are suave, smiling assassins who buy silk, nylon, cigars, petty tyrants, and dictators. They buy countries, people, police, county councils, distant regions where the poor hoard their corn, like misers their gold. Standard Oil awakens them. A president assassinated for a drop of petroleum. A million-acre mortgage, a swift execution in the morning light, a new prison camp for subversives. In Patagonia, betrayals, scattered shots. And zap, you'll see how Standard Oil's letters shine above the clouds, above the seas in your home, illuminating their dominions. A president assassinated for a drop of petroleum. That's, this is written 20 years before the United States destroyed democracy in Iran, when a democratically elected, popular, liberal prime minister, Mohammad Mossadegh, was overthrown in a CIA coup, effectively destroying democracy in Iran, bringing the Shah back from Rome, where he had fled in exile, and launching 26 years of autocratic totalitarian rule, which directly led to the Islamic Revolution of 1978 and 79. So you see, actions have consequences. And of course, in an amnesiac media and an educational system, all of these things are forgotten. They're just washed away. I think there's a river in Greek mythology, I forget the name, I think it begins with L. If you step into it, you forget everything. And there is that quality here, because of the media, because of the educational system, where things are not being imparted about the historical record that really reflects reality. Now, it's important to point out that, of course, Mossadegh, the prime minister of Iran, he had real serious problems. First and foremost, he spoke French. Do I have to say anything more? He was educated at the Sorbonne. He might have been exposed to Jean-Paul Sartre, or Albert Camus, or Simone de Beauvoir, or Cabernet Sauvignon, or Merlot. Je ne sais pas qu'est-ce que c'est. Café au lait, etc. And so he must have picked up weird ideas when he was in France. For example, this weird idea. He believed that the wealth of oil should go to the Iranian people and not to banks in London and New York. Now, isn't that weird? And then he nationalized oil in Iran, and for that, he was overthrown, democracy was destroyed, and a sequence of events followed almost chronologically that has led to the Islamic Revolution, to the Iran-Iraq War, to the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, to the rise of the Mujahideen, to the Taliban, bankrolled by the United States and Saudi Arabia, and enabled by Pakistan. Pakistan was the conduit where these jihadis, and I've interviewed people in Pakistan, that saw plane loads of the most extreme Islamic fundamentalists landing in Karachi and in Islamabad, that were being recruited from Syria, from Morocco, from Lebanon, from Saudi Arabia, from Yemen, coming into Pakistan on their way to fight the great jihad in Afghanistan. So a lot of that past history has been, of course, glossed over, forgotten. They're just crazy. They're just fanatics. They hate us. It's something in Islam. It's something in the Quran. I don't know if you can talk about that if anyone knows the history of Christianity just in the 20th century. It's a little bit blood-stained, I think one could call it that, to say the least. By the way, I want you all to listen to Alternative Radio on Mondays on KUFM. And commercial announcement, and support the station. I mean, it's one of the few, and sad to say, one of the few NPR affiliates around the country that airs alternative radio. Where the program, which is produced weekly in Boulder, is mostly on community access, low-powered FM, small community radio stations. So it's great to be all over the state of Montana on KUFM, and I'm sure they get a lot of static and noise from listeners who are unhappy to hear, the kinds of critiques that I'm delivering this evening. But I've done recent programs on the tar sands, Canada's Mordor with Andrew Nikiforuk, a great Canadian journalist in Alberta. Michael Moore, Thomas Frank, Michael Parenti, Richard Wolff, of course, Noam Chomsky, Cornel West, David Cobb of Move to Amend. Every week there's a new program. I've brought 4 brand new ones, including Medea Benjamin, the wonderful woman activist who's head of Code Pink, co-founder of Code Pink with Jody Evans. She's in Pakistan right now, actually protesting the drone attacks on the Pakistanis. So that's a brand new program. Then Glenn Greenwald that I mentioned earlier, the surveillance state. Paul Cienfuegos, recorded right here in River City. Yes, ending corporate rule. We have KUFM to thank. Beth Ann Austin was kind enough to record this and get me the audio. So that's here, as well as a program by Arun Gupta, one of these brilliant young South Asian Indian voices, talking about the Occupy movement, where it's been and where it's going. So this is a brief commercial message. Sorry, I know I'm here to talk about challenging capitalism. Nevertheless, as you may have heard, the Rankin Center was unable to meet my $100,000 speaking fee. I thought it was very reasonable. That's what war criminals get. When George Bush and Condoleezza Rice and Colin Powell and Dick Cheney and Donald Rumsfeld speak on university campuses or colleges around the country, they get $100,000. The bigger the crime, the bigger the reward. We got sold out, they got bailed out. No. And Lloyd Blankfein of Goldman Sachs had the audacity and temerity to say that Goldman Sachs is doing God's work on earth. That's a direct quote. I guess, conceptions of God have evolved over millennia, because now it's about credit default swaps and leverage buyout obligations and subprime mortgages and looting and ripping people off. I guess that's, in his view, God's work. So there's a bunch of 4 CDs. If you ordered them from Alternative Radio's World Corporate Headquarters in Boulder, it'd be $75. They're only $20 here, and you're supporting independent media. And there are also some books. I only have 2 copies left of the Occupy book, but if you write a check to AR, I can send you, as soon as I get back to Boulder tomorrow, and on Monday I can mail them to you. There's 1 copy of a Chomsky book and some Howard Zinn books there, so I hope you'll pick them out as well. Well, emancipate yourself from mental slavery, as the great 20th century philosopher Bob Marley said in Redemption Song. That's the key to rolling back propaganda. Once you start questioning the basic assumptions. You see, the problem with the corporate media and these corporate journalists who work there, people like Thomas Friedman and David Brooks. I'm singling out the New York Times, Nicholas Kristof. They're good writers. I don't have their skill in writing. But what the problem is, the basic assumptions that are embedded in their ideas. For example, the U.S. has some kind of divine right to intervene anywhere in the world at any time for any reason on any occasion. That's an embedded assumption. So the discussion becomes, as it became last night when Martha Raddatz asked these 2 candidates, or as I saw Anderson Cooper asking someone just a couple of months ago on CNN, how effective will a first strike be on Iran? And then there's a discussion. And I did see the Anderson Cooper discussion. This is typical of media, so-called debate. There's this retired major general, and there's a retired 5-star general, and they have a debate. The debate is, well, if we soften them up with the massive B-52 bombings, and then hit them with Trident missiles offshore, it should do the job. It'll, we could use the daisy cutters and the bunker busters, and it should take care of all of the Iranian facilities. Now the other guy says, well, I don't think that's going to work. I think we need boots on the ground. I think we need to, get into those bunkers, capture those computers, those hard drives, capture those scientists, bring them to Guantanamo, expose them to enhanced interrogation techniques, also known in English as torture. Another one of these words, how the language has been completely emaciated and hollowed out of meaning, that, these words have no meaning whatsoever. And so that's the debate. Instead of A to Z, instead of having someone like Chomsky on, or Parenti, or Angela Davis saying, well, this would be an open violation of the UN Charter. German generals were hanged at Nuremberg, and high officials of the Nazi state were hanged at Nuremberg for what? Not for Auschwitz, by the way, that barely came up. They were hanged because of the crime of aggression, the launching of military action against countries, first strikes against Belgium, against Holland, against France, against Greece. In other words, exactly what the United States did in Afghanistan and Iraq is threatening to do in Iran. The cultural and political illiteracy in the media is so widespread that not a single person has ever even pointed out that the mere threat of military action is violation of the UN Charter. It's not just the use of military action, it's the threat of military action. And the US is doing that night and day, with all options on the table. The clock is ticking. The time is running out on Iran. The window is shrinking. They're using all of these metaphors, and Iran is, of course, completely surrounded by US military forces. It was the great Mark Twain who said, next the statesman will invent cheap lies, putting the blame upon the nation that is attacked. That's always the case. So when the US attacks the Dominican Republic and overthrows a democracy there, it's their fault. What are the Dominicans doing in the Dominican Republic? What are Afghans doing in Afghanistan? They should get out of those countries. We invade Panama, it's their fault. We invade Iraq, it's their fault. We overthrow democracy in Chile, it's their fault. We destroy democracy in Guatemala in 1954. Jacobo Arbenz is overthrown, someone who modeled his government after Franklin D. Roosevelt's New Deal. It's his fault. It's always the fault of the other. There is never fault to be found here at home. So this is Twain writing at the time of another spasm of imperialist violence in 1898, 1899, when reasons were concocted to attack Spain, to seize Cuba and Puerto Rico and the Philippines and Guam and other islands in the South Pacific. Totally fabricated, totally invented reasons. And so next the statesman will invent cheap lies, putting the blame upon the nation that is attacked, and every man will be glad of those conscience-soothing falsities and will diligently study them and refuse to examine any refutations of them, and thus he will by and by be convinced himself that war is just and will thank God for the better sleep he enjoys after this process of grotesque self-deception. So I think as citizens of a democratic society, we're still, as problematic as the democracy is, there's still space, there's still opportunity to speak. There is still alternative radio on KUFM. There's still the Rankin Center. There's still this film series that we saw last night. There's still openings where we can express ourselves, but those openings are contracting. They're not expanding, and I think that's a very worrisome development, as we go forward. Now, I want to now move to, that was part one, kind of. I want to talk a little bit more about this book, Occupy the Economy and Challenging Capitalism. I was in Eugene a couple of months ago during the Republican primaries. Does anyone remember that? That was a great moment in intellectual activity. I mean, It's hard to, I'm glad you're laughing, because it was indeed laughable. And I happened to pick up a brochure of Ron Paul, who's still a candidate there, and I'm, not picking on Ron Paul, but, it's very typical of the campaign literature that's passed out. There's the candidate, looking very steadfast and into the future. Again, I'll hold this close to the microphone so you can all see. And underneath him are the founding fathers. So there's some urgent connection between the founding fathers and Ron Paul. And you'll notice that every political candidate, no matter what his stripe, tries to make his or her connection with this now deified and sanctified group of people. And yes, they're considered godlike. Michael Parenti calls them the founding finaglers, which I think might be, a little more descriptive and more accurate than this kind of fantasies that we have about them. But if you're wondering about the political economy of the United States and what we're so-called enjoying today, it goes right back to these founding fathers. From the very early documents, if you look at them, what James Madison said, who wrote, two-time president of the United States, he wrote most of the Federalist Papers. Hamilton wrote a few, most of them were written by Madison. He wrote the Constitution, or most of it. He said that the aim of government, I'm quoting here directly, the aim of government is to protect the opulent minority against the majority. That's the aim of government, is to protect the opulent minority against the majority. And his colleague John Jay went one step further. John Jay was the first president of the Constitutional Congress, one of these founding finaglers. He was also the first Chief Justice of the United States Supreme Court. He said straight out, those that own the country ought to govern it. And there you have, if that's not a proclamation of the 1% against the 99%, I don't know what clearer evidence you might need. And pretty much the US economy has evolved, with some exceptions. There has been some periods of democratic revival. There has been some redistribution of wealth. But right now, the country is experiencing the most acute inequality, income inequality, and wealth inequality in its history. We're talking more than the Gilded Age, more than the Roaring 20s. And I want to make something that Wolf points out in Occupy the Economy. There's a huge difference between income inequality and wealth inequality. Okay, income inequality, let's say, okay, you're still making $107,000. I'm making $67,000. Okay, that's our income difference. He makes $40,000 more than I do. But this gentleman has houses in Aspen. He has chalets in Gstaad, Switzerland. He owns property on Fifth Avenue in New York. He has a private jet. He has hedge funds. He has stocks. He has property all over the Northwest. He has huge amounts of wealth that I simply don't have. I just have my income. So that disparity has really taken off since the early 1980s. In fact, Wolf defines it as beginning with the great Hollywood actor Ronald Reagan, who was president then, who ushered in this whole idea of tax cuts for the rich, subsidies for large corporations, actually continuing a pattern of subsidies for large agribusiness and military contractors. And it was also at that time, the first action of Reagan's was very significant. He smashed the labor union. And he put the labor union on notice to kneel, back down. And they did back down to their shame. And the incompetent Lane Kirkland, who was the president of the AFL-CIO at the time, was more concerned about bringing democracy to workers in Poland than he was about bringing democracy and fair wages and working conditions to workers right here in the United States. That was the first betrayal. The second betrayal is that the corporations discovered outsourcing. Wow, we don't have to have factories in Colorado or Indiana or Ohio or Missouri. We can have them in Bangladesh, in Pakistan, we don't have to worry about environmental rules or OSHA rules or any of these things, or unions. What are those? We don't need those. So hundreds of thousands of well-paying jobs. Some of you might be older to remember pensions, health care, paid vacations. Does this ring a bell with anyone? I mean, that used to be part of a working class job description. All of those things start to disappear in the early 1980s. And I want to stress this is very much a bipartisan attack on working people in this country. And NAFTA was a huge nail in the coffin in terms of democratic rights and these kinds of tendencies, and it's just accelerated ever since then. So you had tax cuts, massive tax cuts, outsourcing, attacks on unions, and wages go flat. Wages for workers go flat, and profits skyrocket. Okay, now you're a CEO, and this is the time when wages, what are called compensation packages, another euphemism, that is the private jet, the prostitutes on call, the house here, the limos and all of that. These compensation packages also skyrocket beginning in the 1980s. It used to be, I mean, it's always been inequality, but 8-10 to 1 was about the ratio. Now it's 400 to 1. That the head of a company is making 400 times on average what the worker in that company is making. And the corporations are now flooded with profits from cutting wages go flat, profits skyrocket because of outsourcing, and they've got all of this cash, and they're now, there's a merger media. Takeovers, that's where the media corporations start consolidating. And in every sector of the economy, even funeral homes, even drugstores, you have now this kind of concentration of wealth, takeovers and mergers of these companies. And workers who have seen their wages go flat have to do what? Credit cards. They go into debt. So we have a credit card nation beginning again in the 80s. Do you remember? It wasn't that long ago. Hardly a week went by when you didn't get an offer in the mail for a credit card. Come on, it's easy, no money down, and it'll be easy to pay off, don't worry about it. And that's how one-way workers tried to compensate for their wages going flat in the early 1980s. The other thing they did was take on second jobs, work longer hours. Productivity, as I said, went up. More people joined the workforce, and they did second and third shifts. So there was, tremendous stress on workers, on families during this period, and of course it's continuing until today. I think, it's important to identify the root causes of any economic crisis or any kind of political crisis, because if we don't identify the root causes, then all of the cures that are proposed will not be effective. And I think here we see, in terms of the capitalist economic system, which is again euphemistically called the free market. It's not free, by the way. It's heavily is dependent on state intervention. The tax code is a weapon of class warfare. Someone is like Warren Buffett has openly said this. Yeah, there is a class war going on in this country, and he should know. He's in a position to know. And he said, and my class is winning it. Occasionally they let the cat out of the bag because, some of these things are so grotesque and so blatant, it's hard to mask over. He was the one that said, proportionally speaking, my secretary pays more in taxes than I do. As head of Berkshire Hathaway, he's one of the richest men, not just in the country, but in the world. So there has been this, tremendous consolidation of capital, of concentration of capital in fewer and fewer hands, and the working class has been pauperized systematically. The unions have been completely defanged. I mean, this goes back, I mean, it's not fair to just single out Reagan, because the attack on unions really begins in the 40s and 50s during the McCarthy witch hunts, when all of the leftist organizers, and they were leftists primarily, that's where the left had its roots, were purged from union after union, leaving people like Lane Kirkland and George Meany in place to essentially become Gompers-like union. These are unions that collaborated with the owners and the masters of these companies. Now, I think, again, propaganda goes way back. The conscious and intelligent manipulation of the organized habits and opinions of the masses is an important element in democratic society. Those who manipulate this unseen mechanism of society constitute an invisible government, which is the true ruling power of our country. Now, that was said by a man whose name is Edward Bernays. You may or may not know him. He is the father of modern propaganda. He was involved in Woodrow Wilson's Committee on Public Information, again, a very euphemistic term. It was a committee devised by Wilson to galvanize support for U.S. entry into World War I. Here Jeannette Rankin comes in as one of the few people to stand up to oppose U.S. intervention in that war. And this is when there was a massive propaganda campaign in the U.S. to convince people that entry into the war was just and moral. Mind you, Wilson in 1916, the very year before, campaigned and won as president of the United States on a platform of keeping the U.S. out of World War I. But as we saw, I don't know if you, and many of you saw that film last night, guess what? Politicians will tell you anything to get elected. Breaking news. They'll make promises left, right, and center in order to get your vote. So, this is what happens. Bernays is an infamous character in U.S. history, certainly has the blood of hundreds of thousands of people, if not millions. Why do I say that? This is the guy who convinced women in the 1920s to smoke, that smoking was cool. Full-page ads in Life and Look and the Saturday Evening Post and other very popular magazines and radio programs at that time. Radio was just starting in the 1920s. Be independent, be all that you can be. Show men that you're right there with them, and start smoking. So that was his great campaign. He was also involved in the overthrow of the democracy in Guatemala in 1954. And in terms of, I'm covering a couple of bases here, Obama, in his acceptance speech in Charlotte 3 or 4 Thursdays ago, time is kind of getting blurred because I'm traveling and speaking in so many different places, but it was about three or 4 weeks ago, he announced that as president, the United States would have the strongest military the world has ever known. It's okay, I mean, that's quite a boast to make. How about the strongest educational system the world has ever known? How about the strongest healthcare system the world has ever known? Or, the strongest environment the world has ever known? Again, why is homage constant and fealty constantly paid to the Pentagon? What kind of control do they have over the political system? That is a question that has to be asked, that is never asked, unfortunately, in the corporate control media, and even in lots of the alternative media, where there's attention paid to rotten apples in the system, not the barrel that produces the apples. So you have a systemic problem, not a cosmetic one. And constantly what we see with Democrats and Republicans, you can see I'm pretty fed up with these two almost similar parties. There's a little bit of daylight between the two. we have all of this attention on reform. So like when it comes to capitalism, let's reinstate the Glass-Steagall Act, which was repealed by Clinton in 1999. It was a huge mistake. This is all the propaganda that's coming down. Let's pass the Dodd-Frank bill. Well, when you have the wolves and the foxes in the henhouse designing the architecture of the henhouse, do you think that they're going to seal the henhouse so that they can't get in? Or are they going to create some openings and latches for them to be able to get into the henhouse? The answer is transparent. And this repeats itself over and over again. So the Dodd-Frank bill is full of loopholes, full of openings. Matt Taibbi wrote about this in Rolling Stone 3 or 4 months ago. And it can't possibly be effective in terms of monitoring Wall Street. They don't want to monitor Wall Street. They want Wall Street's money. That's how the political system works. And since the passage, the Supreme Court Citizens United horrendous decision of January 2012, it has opened the floodgates of corporate money, which is now can be, donations can be made in secret to these political action committees, and now the whole political system is basically, it's an auction. Who do we have a bidder here? I think what Ralph Nader said years ago was that these Congress people and senators that supposedly represent us, they should actually wear numbers corresponding to the amount of money they get from ExxonMobil and Chevron Texaco and Northrop Grumman and these corporations. So when you see number 7, it's not John Elway of the Denver Broncos, it's ExxonMobil. That senator represents ExxonMobil. Then I think maybe we would have a better understanding of how the political process is working. It's working for them. It's not working for you. It's not working for your children. It's not working for your grandchildren. It is a successful economic system for that 1%. In fact, even a sliver of that 1%. Michael Parenti said it was about 150,000 people where most of the wealth is concentrated. And so we go through these cycles over and over again. This is the greatest economic collapse since the late 1920s, early 1930s. There's been 16 economic recessions since the Great Depression. It kind of tells you something about this economic system. It is somewhat unstable, as Richard Wolff would say. And he uses he's got a great way about him, he's from New York, like I am, if you didn't pick up my accent. After doing radio for 30 years, I've, learned to say water and idea, where I used to say water and idea. But he said, it's a perfect example is you've got a fridge on the fritz, right? And I'm your repairman. And I come to you and I say, oh, look, buddy, this condenser is broken. It's going to cost you, $3,600 to replace it. Furthermore, we don't even have the part. It's made in China. Probably takes 6 months to get here. Now I'm looking at, it looks like, it seems like you have some mice in your house. They've eaten all the wiring. Well, I've got to bring in an electrician to do that kind of work. I don't even know how to fix that. That's going to cost you an arm and a leg. Then I see your ice machine is not working. That's going to cost a huge amount of money to fix. You know what? You should consider whether you want to make these repairs and patchwork up this fridge to keep going for a few more weeks, or find out a different way of preserving your food. Come up with something different. And that's kind of the metaphor that I use to describe a system that is fundamentally flawed, that is now driving profits at a never-before-seen rate into the hands of a few. And I think people should be angry about it. And I think there is an anger in the country. Some of it is incoherent. Some of it is just rage. When you feel you've lost your job. You're one of 12 million Americans whose homes have been repossessed by banks. You're one of 10 million Americans whose homes are now underwater. That's to say their mortgage is worth less than the property value of the home. You're one of the maybe 23 to 25 million people who don't have work. If you don't know, if you're not out of work yourself, surely you know someone or have heard of someone that is, suffering this kind of economic calamity. So the system itself cannot heal itself. And so, and then we're faced with politicians, who are basically giving you a choice between arsenic and cyanide. That's what it feels like to me. I'm sorry, maybe there's some Obama fans out there, or I was going to say McCain, but this other guy, the Bain Capital. It's hard. They're kind of interchangeable, actually. But, so you have a choice. Yeah, we have this thing called elections. We're supposed to turn out every 4 years. So you could, choose between cyanide and arsenic. Well, if you take the arsenic, you could live for 6 to 9 months. You could have another birthday. Maybe your grandson is graduating from college. Do a few things. You'll be in a lot of pain, but, we'll get you some morphine. Ultimately, you'll die. But, you've got 6, 9 months you can hang out. Or you can take cyanide and just go like that. So, pick your poison. That's what we're served up with by the political powers that be. And it was someone, again, not a radical, but a very conservative. Conservative, not the way conservative is used today, but in the old use of the term, a very honorable political term. Louis Brandeis, who was appointed Chief Justice to the U.S. Supreme Court by FDR, he said, we can have democracy in this country, or we can have wealth concentrated in the hands of a few. We cannot have both. And you see the trends toward increasing anti-democratic laws that are being passed, the growth of the surveillance state, the violence of the U.S. state externally, which continues to subordinate, put other countries under our thumb. Why? Not for democracy, but for profits, in order to loot, to plunder. This is the nature of the capitalist economic system. I mean, I'm not saying that, there's an alternative that jumps up that can possibly replace it. We need a lot of time to be talking about democratic socialism in the United States, but I think that is something that we can talk about, and many more people are, in fact, turning to worker-owned, worker-controlled co-ops, profit sharing in some cases, or non-profit sharing, that's actually in a renaissance in this country. There's been lots of studies of this done. I was just in the Bay Area within the last few weeks. I learned of a group in the East Bay of carpenters and masons and roofers and other workers that have formed a co-op. I came across a worker-run cafe in the Mission District on Valencia Street. More and more we see the growth of that kind of economic organization. It has to start on a small scale. We can't start by taking over General Electric or General Motors or General Dynamics. That's not going to happen. But it starts locally with these nascent groups. We also see it in farmers markets, in community-supported agriculture. Those kinds of efforts are very, very important and are growing. There's a very successful cooperative, not in the United States, but in Spain, in the Basque region of Mondragon, which has 120,000 workers as members. And it's not just one thing that they're doing. It's multiple types of activities that they're engaged in, from construction to agricultural work. So there are some really good models out there. But again, to go back to the New Deal and FDR, it was Roosevelt who warned, the liberty of a democracy is not safe if the people tolerate the growth of a private power to the point where it becomes stronger than their democratic state itself. That, in essence, is fascism. Now, this is coming from a blue blood. I mean, this is an aristocrat. He's part of the ruling class, identifying that, just as Warren Buffett is part of the ruling class. And there is a ruling class, and we should be able to talk about it. So all of the attention is paid to the rotten apples, right? Like Bernie Madoff. What a terrible man he was. How dare he do those things to, he impoverished widows and grandmothers. He took, food from children, from orphans. Let's put him away. Let's beat our breasts and denounce him as a horrible, horrible man. Or Raj Rajaratnam of a hedge fund owner in New York of the Galleon funds, guilty of insider trading. He and Rajat Gupta and some others, made millions and millions of dollars by basically doing what's been going on in Wall Street since Wall Street was created, insider trading. Hey, I got a tip, dude. You want to score some money? Bet on this horse. It's like sports almost. Bet on this horse, it'll be a winner tomorrow for you. And of course, I expect to see a little return for that little tip, that little piece of information. So Raj Rajaratnam, terrible guy, send him off. The barrel that produces these guys over and over again, have we forgotten Ivan Boesky? Have we forgotten Michael Milken and Ken Lay and all of these other, corporados who have been, extremely corrupt? It's part and parcel of what the barrel produces. We need to be looking at the barrel. It's a systemic problem, not a cosmetic one. So passing this or that reform is not going to do the trick. It hasn't done it historically, and it won't do it in the present circumstances as well. I mean, that's why I think, the Occupy movement at least injected not just energy into the political atmosphere in the country, but it injected this vocabulary of income inequality, of 1%, 99%, of wealth inequality, about the power of the banks and Wall Street to manipulate Washington, to basically control politics. So we as citizens are left with what? Turn out every 4 years and vote for this or that candidate, and then go back home and watch, the Rams 49ers game, or the Grizzlies tomorrow, or Seinfeld and Law and Order reruns, or Late Night with Letterman or Jay Leno. That's how we fulfill ourselves. That's how they would like to see us be, sheep essentially. I remember there was a book written in the late 50s by William Lederer called A Nation of Sheep, and we are being led around by the nose, and we're given these fictions of democracy that these elections really matter. I don't think they matter very much. I think they matter on a local level. I think there are things you could do locally in your school boards, city councils, and that. But once you're going up the food chain, I mean, you're talking about huge amounts of money. And where are the huge amounts of money coming from? The corporations and the banks, because they want to control the game. They want people in there who will craft legislation, rig the tax code to benefit them. It makes sense. They're not dummies. They want to maximize gain. So I'm going to now do a little bit different, something a little bit different, and that is to get into a little bit of cultural information, because I think culture is really important. And poetry is important to break down some stereotypes, to create other spaces in your mind. Art can do that. Beautiful fabric and music can liberate us in many ways and expand consciousness, and also act as a kind of serum to all this toxicity that is, awash in the political and economic system. And I want to start with a poem by Marge Piercy from her collection, The Moon is Always Female. She's an outstanding poet and novelist, lives in Massachusetts. And this speaks to the need of solidarity. This speaks for the need of community. So I'm going back to Boulder tomorrow morning. You're still here. The Rankin Center is here. It's important that you do things here locally. People are asking me, what should I do? I don't know. I don't live in this community. I live in Boulder. I'm doing a lot of things there. You're here. What you do right here on the ground counts a lot. The moon is always female. What can they do to you? Whatever they want. They can set you up, they can bust you, they can break your fingers, they can blur you with drugs till you can't walk. They can take your child. They can do anything. You can't stop them. How can you stop them? Alone you can fight, you can refuse, you can take what revenge you can, but they simply roll over you. I want to talk to you a little bit about poetry in South Asia, that is to say India and Pakistan and Sri Lanka, Bangladesh. It's a kind of geopolitical unit. Poetry is very, very powerful, particularly in oral tradition societies where there's large numbers of illiterate people, but people know poetry. And I live in Boulder, where there's the Naropa Institute. Allen Ginsberg set up the Jack Kerouac School of Disembodied Poets in the 1970s, and people like Lawrence Ferlinghetti and Gregory Corso and other great, Gary Snyder. Lots of great poets come in and out of Boulder, you know. If 50 or 60 people turn out at a poetry reading in Boulder, I mean, they're tickled pink. They say, wow, look at the interest in poetry in this community. You know, we really have a base here. Well, you know, in South Asia and India and Pakistan, I've attended poetry recitals where there was 100, 200, 300,000 people, you know, spread out on a field, sitting on very rough carpets called dari, and if they were lucky, there'd be a khaima, a tent, on top to protect them if it would rain. And you would see this, people, the poets would recite one line, and the people would repeat the second line. They know the poetry. That's how much a part of their lives it is. And there's one great poet today, the greatest Urdu poet. Urdu is the national language of Pakistan. It's also widely spoken in North India as well as in Kashmir. And its greatest poet of the 20th century is Faiz Ahmed Faiz. That's right. His first name and his last name is the same, F-A-I-Z. You can Google it. It means munificence, beneficence, you know, kindness. He was a Red and proud of it. He was a poet and proud of it. He was a journalist and proud of it. And because of his political activity, he was imprisoned many times by US-favored dictators like Ayub Khan and others. And his most famous poem is called Bol. Now you will learn a word in not just Urdu, but in Hindi as well. Bol is the imperative to speak. So in political demonstrations in India, where Devanagari, that's to say Sanskrit, is the national script, you see signs that say Bol. And then in neighboring Pakistan, also in Kashmir, you see it in the Arab Persian script, Bol, and it means the same thing, speak. Bol ke lab azad hai tere, bol zaban ab tak teri hai. Speak, your lips are free. Speak, your tongue is still yours. Speak, there is little time, but little though it is enough time, enough before the body perishes, before the tongue atrophies. Speak, the truth still lives. Say what you have to say. Speak, your lips are free. Bol, bol, bol. Speak. And I must say, last night, there was some very depressing comments made in the audience. One person in particular just evinced a great deal of despair about doing anything, about changing the political system or the economy. And you know, one can understand that because of the inequities and inequalities in the politics, because of the horrendous performance of the corporate control media, because of the weakness of the educational system that doesn't really impart critical thinking and destructuring of arguments and analyses. But you know, I think the answer to that is what Eduardo Galeano, the great Uruguayan writer, said. We have to save depression for better times. It would really be an indulgence now to be depressed. And I have to tell you again, based on what I've seen, I've been with some of the most wretchedly poor and disadvantaged people on the face of this earth. Nothing compared to the poverty that you see here in the United States. I mean, people living in the open with no running water, no electricity, many of the advantages that we have here. Those people are fighting back against the corporados, particularly in India, where corporations, prodded by their cousins in the United States and Canada, are extracting bauxite and iron ore and manganese and coal and all kinds of resources from the soil. Plunder, because that's what capitalism is. In its DNA, it has to plunder. It cannot be an eco-conscious economic system. I mean, if you believe that, then you believe pigs fly. You know, maybe they do, but there's not a lot of evidence to support it. This is a system that privileges profits over everything else. It is like a cancer that constantly is metastasizing and will ultimately eat its own host. It cannot help itself. So smart guys, and these are smart guys like Amory Lovins, who lives in Boulder, by the way, and Paul Hawken, you know, they've written about natural capitalism, eco-friendly capitalism. Well, they're just dreaming. There is no possibility of that. Yeah, sure, you can drive a Prius. Sure, you can recycle plastic and paper, and, you know, those are good things to do. But unless the system is fundamentally changed, it cannot possibly be a steward for the Earth's resources. We are a pale blue dot in this entire universe. That's what Carl Sagan called this Earth. It is so precious. There's nothing like it that we know of. And it is being destroyed systematically in the name of greed, in the name of profits. And that, you know, is something that we have to reverse, or the future is, you know, very dark indeed. I'm not going to say what it might be, but, you know, this one report after another, one scientific investigation after another should not leave anyone in doubt as to what's happening to the planet, what's happening at the polar ice caps, with the warming of the oceans, the rise of ocean water, the droughts, all of the extreme weather that the planet is experiencing. Should be ample evidence for even the most devout climate deniers like Senator Inhofe from Oklahoma, who called it a hoax. So that, I mean, that's in its DNA. It cannot help itself. And I mean, I told this anecdote last night. There were a few people there. Sorry to repeat myself. But there's a New Yorker cartoon where there's a CEO is in some big hotel in New York, and, you know, all his stockholders are there, and they're all like, you know, where are our dividends? Where are our dividends? And, you know, he's got some charts behind him showing arrows pointing this way and that way and saying, okay, you know, and then he announces to the stockholders, while the long-term prospects for the planet are very grim indeed, with widespread hunger, famine, wars, and devastation and destruction, in the short term, the prospects for profits are rosier than ever. And all the stockholders jump up and give him a standing ovation and, you know, renew his compensation package. They can only think in terms of the short term. They cannot think in terms of the long term. Otherwise, he's out of a job. And there are 100 people, you know, right behind him waiting to take that job. And he knows it. So he's got to produce profits. And profits in this system is primarily based on extraction of resources. Resources that cannot be replenished, that are finite. They're not infinite. Plus, they're, you know, for example, the tar sands right now, something that a lot of you know about, has been described as the most environmentally destructive project in the history of the world. And it's happening just north of Montana. Arundhati Roy, just to stay in South Asia for a moment, an incredibly courageous woman and an absolutely brilliant writer. I don't know of anyone writing in English today with greater skill and acumen and incisiveness than Arundhati Roy, and I'm proud to call her a friend. I've known her for many years. She's been featured on alternative radio multiple times, most recently in a program called Capitalism, a Ghost Story. You know, check it out on the website, alternativeradio.org. She is under constant death threats. She's threatened by Hindu nationalists who don't like what she's saying about Kashmir. She's threatened by Hindu capitalists who don't like her criticizing predatory capitalism in India. Her home has been vandalized. Very courageous woman. You know, she's all of maybe 4'11", tops. but absolutely a dear, dear person. She wrote this in 2002. I want you to note the year, 10 years ago. Fortunately, power has a shelf life. When the time comes, maybe this mighty empire will, like others before it, overreach itself and implode from within. It looks as though structural cracks have already appeared. As the war on terror casts its net wider and wider, America's corporate heart is hemorrhaging. There's endless empty chatter about democracy. But nobody really knows anything about it. Who rules? Nobody elected them. Nobody said they could make decisions on our behalf. A world run by a handful of greedy bankers and CEOs who nobody elected can't possibly last. The time has come, the walrus said. Perhaps things will get worse and then better. Perhaps there's a small God up in heaven readying herself for us. Another world is not only possible, she's on her way. Maybe many of us won't be here to greet her, but on a quiet day, if I listen very carefully, I can hear her breathing. Arundhati Roy. And one of the great cultural figures of this era is Gil Scott-Heron. He is the progenitor and the father of, or godfather of hip-hop and rap. You know, a tremendous cultural force. Someone I greatly, greatly admired. Unfortunately, he passed away a couple of years ago. Perhaps his most famous work is The Revolution Will Not Be Televised. I have, with my credentials as director of alternative radio, have slightly changed the lyrics to update them a bit. So imagine this, and this will be sung or recited to A Night in Tunisia. The revolution will not be televised. You'll not be able to stay home, brothers and sisters. You'll not be able to plug in, turn on, and cop out. You'll not be able to lose yourself on Star Trek reruns. The revolution will not be televised. The revolution will not be televised. The revolution will not be brought to you in 4 parts by JP Morgan Chase, Wells Fargo, Citicorp, and Bank of America without commercial interruptions. The revolution will not be televised. The revolution will not be brought to you by CBS, NBC, PBS, MSNBC, CNN, NPR, or ABC, and will not star Julia Roberts and Tom Hanks. The revolution will not give your mouth sex appeal. The revolution will not get rid of zits. The revolution will not make you look 5 pounds thinner, because the revolution will not be televised. You'll not be able to, you don't have to worry about your iPhones, iPads, iMacs, iClouds, or iPods. The revolution will not be sung by Justin Bieber or Taylor Swift or Lady Gaga. The revolution will not be televised. The revolution will not be right back after a message about a white tornado, a white out, white lightning, white chocolate, or white people. You don't have to worry about a dove in your tank, a tiger in your tank, or the giant in your toilet bowl. The revolution will not go better with Coca-Cola, Sprite, or Diet Pepsi. The revolution will not fight germs that may cause bad breath. The revolution will not be televised, not be televised, not be televised. There'll be no reruns, brothers and sisters. The revolution will be live on alternative radio. Thank you very much. Thank you, Missoula. Give yourself a hand. You can make the difference. Each and every one of you are the difference makers. Don't wait for somebody in Washington or Helena to do that. You are the difference makers. You are the heart of democracy. Well, those were my opening remarks. Betsy said I should speak for 4 hours. Is that? I guess not. So we do have a little bit of time for comments, and I'd love to sign some books and get some CDs into your hands. So just a couple of questions. I've got, unfortunately, a dreadfully early flight tomorrow morning back to Colorado. So a couple of questions real quick, or comments. Yes.
What's it like when you travel?
What's it like when I travel?
You know, the government checking up on you and the NSA harassing you. How much freedom you have?
Well, I was in it, the last time I went to India, I was deported because of my reporting on democracy, on what's happening in Kashmir. That India is the world's largest democracy. That's its kind of title. You know, the US is the world's second largest democracy. So I can't get into India. It's been over a year. It's a very Kafkaesque situation. I don't know why I was deported. I don't know who is accusing me and what I'm being accused of. But clearly, states are using frontiers, particularly airports, to monitor dissident voices. So I was regarded by the world's largest democracy as a threat and not allowed in, even though I had a valid visa. Inside the country, you know, occasionally I'm asked questions, like when I came back from Syria a couple of years ago, I was pulled over at the Denver airport. By the way, it's the worst thing you could possibly hear at an airport, you know, come with me, please. You never want to hear those words because you're in a legal twilight zone. You have no rights whatsoever. The state has maximum rights. And so there's not much you can do, you know, and it's no time for dry humor or sarcasm or irony, which I am kind of rich of. So this inspector was saying, well, you know, what were you doing in Syria? I said, well, I was, you know, doing some programming, talking to people, traveling around the country. He said, don't you know that they hate America? I said, no, I didn't. I said, you know, everyone I met was very friendly and very kind. In fact, I couldn't even spend any money in Syria. Everywhere I went, people were buying me coffee, buying me meals, you know, even paying for my bus fare and taxis in some instances. People were very, very friendly. He said, no, they hate America. You shouldn't be going there. And then, you know, he kind of let me go. He did pick up one book, and he found going through my bags. It was a picture that I did of a book called Terrorism, Theirs and Ours. I don't have copies of it with me here. I'll have them in Boulder when I get back. It has the most extraordinary picture imaginable. There is Ronald Reagan, the paragon of democracy and decency, meeting the Afghan mujahideen in the Oval Office. These homicidal maniacs, misogynists, and patriarchs, you know, with the President of the United States. He looked at this as, this is kind of an interesting program. And I said, yeah, look who's there. That's Ronald Reagan with the Afghan mujahideen, who later many of them turned into the Taliban and into the, you know, the jihadis that the U.S. is now fighting. She said, wow, this is very interesting. And he wrote down the title of the book. I don't know if he got it. He said, I got to look into it. He asked me, can I get it on the internet? I said, yeah. And then he seized a couple of tangerines that I had forgotten in my backpack. So no tangerines for terrorists. Don't you know you can't bring food into the United States? So I lost those tangerines. I had innocently forgotten them in my backpack. So, you know, things like that, but it's a very unpleasant experience. I mean, the whole thing is constantly humiliating. It's constantly degrading. I feel like strangling these people every time I see them. You know, just on a trip to Fresno, that was like last week, I saw these elderly people in wheelchairs being humiliated. You know, being asked questions, being searched. I mean, it's completely, it's an enforcement mechanism that has lost common sense. It's extremely intrusive. I'm in much greater danger, quite frankly, riding my bike around in Boulder, you know, from cars and being hit by a car than I am, you know, by a plane being hijacked. Many more people die on the roads in this country than on all of the air hijackings combined. But this huge bureaucracy has been created. By the way, they have all the kinds of benefits that most of us don't have, including health care, paid vacations, paid sick leave, pensions, you know, all those ancient things that were part of the work of working class jobs in this country. So it's become a huge bureaucracy, and it'll perpetuate itself. They get more and more fancy machines, even though with this new machine, I'm constantly patted down all the time. Even when I wear a t-shirt, apparently the t-shirt shows up on this $1 million machine. I mean, it's stuff for Saturday Night Live if it were not so tragic, if it were not so anti-democratic, and if it were not so intrusive and the harbingers of a police state. It's very disturbing. Yes?
Could you say something about the violence towards women and incredible amount of incest and sexual abuse of children and how that all fits into this picture?
Well,
No one's talking about it.
now there is some discussion about violence against women, particularly in military families. There has been, where in the state that I live, which is one of the most militarized states in the country, Colorado with Cheyenne Mountain, the Air Force Academy, Fort Carson, Lowry, and another Air Force base. You have one at Great Falls. But there's a huge investigation going on now of violence within the military, of a lot of returning GIs that vent their anger on their spouses and girlfriends, beating them, killing themselves. There's a tremendous amount of military-related violence, but the misogyny and patriarchy have not been eliminated. I dare say most people don't even recognize those terms when they're used. And they're not used often enough. Basically, it's very much still a male-dominated culture. I was looking at the statistics when Jeannette Rankin was in the Congress. There are fewer women in Congress today than when Rankin was serving, I think, if memory serves correctly. So, you have women still earning 75 cents to every dollar that a man makes. So these are deeply rooted cultural components. I can't ascribe them necessarily to capitalism per se, but definitely to imperialism and imperial violence, which privileges force over discussion, which privileges military action over negotiation, which privileges threats and the use of threats over just common discourse. I think that greatly contributes to a sense of violence being legitimate. It's okay to be violent. And violence against women, they're vulnerable. And there's a deep history there. It's something we, as a society, we need to be talking about and we need to overcome. Thanks very much.